So it's a really good awareness that I think you should be able to give to all your employees, and take the information home as well. So I'll knock out the BWC updates, and then we'll turn it over back over to Susan and Joe for the actual presentation. So as always, I like to start off with our upcoming webinars, or the ones we just finished up. Again, if you've missed any of these, you can log on to our BWC Learning Center website and just type the title of the webinar in, and you'll be able to review this or play it at any point in time. If you want to use it for in-house training to assist you with that, you're more than welcome to do that. So on May 11th, we actually had a 2-hour webinar. Most of them are 1 hour in length, but this was a 2-hour webinar on conducting safety inspections in the workplace. On May 25th, we're going to have a webinar on basically looking at fatigue and is it affecting your safety program. On June 8th, I'm actually doing a webinar on OSHA knocks on the door. So if you have not been through an OSHA inspection, or maybe you have been and it didn't really go so well, I would encourage you to hop on this webinar, or perhaps maybe you're the person that deals with an OSHA inspection, but if you're on vacation potentially, who's your backup? Are they able to take care of an OSHA inspection? And if not, I would encourage them to hop on that webinar. I'll try to throw a lot of good information to everyone in the hour allotment time that I have. As far as actual virtual classes, we had a couple earlier in the month, but we still have some coming up over the rest of this month and into June. So we had an accident analysis, lockout, tagout, and a confined space course a little bit earlier in the month. We do have Safety Series 3, which is a combination of HAZCOM and personal protective equipment. That was on the 13th. Violence in the workplace, on May 18th, there was a work zone and traffic control course on May 19th. Safety Series 2, I'm actually assisting with that one. That's Thursday. Ergonomics, accident analysis, and hazard assessments. And then on the 26th is machine guarding basics. Moving on, I think I may have mentioned this at the last meeting, but just to kind of reiterate, we do have some of our grant programs opening up again. There's a trench safety grant, school safety and security grant. That's actually a $40,000 grant. Firefighter exposure to elements grant, and then there is an employers working with persons with developmental disabilities grant. All those grants, they had been kind of put on hold during the pandemic, but we just opened these back up again. So if you need any information on these, please reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to help you out. OSHA's updated a couple items on their website. Mostly they had some posters that are now in both English and in Spanish. One was in regards to the National Safety Stand Down, but there's a lot of good information on those posters, even though we're post the actual Safety Stand Down week. They also have a poster they've updated in English and Spanish related to grain safety. NIOSH has updated a couple items on their website. They have a survey for a worker well-being tool that's available to all employers, and you can use that with your employees. They have some information on opioid overdoses, vaccine site safety fact sheets, and then also COVID-19 resources specifically geared towards the construction industry. So, and then one last thing I wanted to touch on before I hand it back over to Susan and Joe is I have an employer kind of in the northern portion of Ohio. It's looking to have a construction OSHA 10-hour class. They don't have enough employees, for us to have the class at this point in time. So if anybody on the call, if you're looking for an OSHA 10-hour class, I'm going to pop my email down in the chat box. But if you're looking to have an OSHA 10-hour construction course, it will be virtual. All of our classes, just like our webinars and everything like that, are virtual at this point in time. But contact me, and maybe we could try to coordinate a time to get enough people together to have an OSHA 10-hour class. Again, just like all of our classes, webinars, they're included with your premium. Doesn't cost you a penny. So just feel free to reach out to me, and hopefully we can work something out. So Susan, I'll hand it back over to you and Joe.
Okay, can you hear me okay, Susan?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, Joe. Let me just mention that if anybody on this call did not receive the flyer, we are being joined by Joe Boggs. He's assistant professor with the Ohio State University Extension in Hamilton County. He's a statewide specialist, has over 29 years of experience specializing in tree and shrub diagnostics and pest management. And as mentioned, he's going to be speaking with us this morning about poison hemlock and wild parsnip. All yours, Joe.
All right. Hang on just a second. Hopefully I can, can everybody see this okay without seeing the panel off to the side? Great. Okay.
Correct.
So we are going to talk about, hang on for a minute. We're going to talk about two very concerning weeds, poison hemlock and wild parsnip. And I really do appreciate um, being given this opportunity because I do a lot of pesticide applicator training. Ohio State actually does a good bit of the training for recertification and certification by the Ohio Department of Agriculture. So there are many situations where you have to be licensed in order to apply pesticides. And so I do a lot of that training, which in many respects has to do with occupational safety, because we want to make sure that the people who are making applications are staying safe. And this is actually a presentation that came out of that. So poison hemlock and wild parsnips and bad weeds. Well, we have a lot of bad weeds in Ohio. Lesser celandine is a beautiful weed, and here's kind of a common denominator between some of these bad weeds. Lesser celandine is a non-native, and a beautiful yellow flower. I mean, who wouldn't want this in their landscaping? Well, you may not when you can see what it's doing. This is out in the forest. This is actually up behind Spring Grove Cemetery and Arboretum, and it's not supposed to look like that. So it's highly invasive. People did not know that when they brought lesser celandine to this country as an ornamental. And of course, we forget dandelions. Same thing. Dandelions, they were originally brought here as an ornamental. And of course, now we can enjoy their puffballs. Canada thistle. I think the name maybe says it all, except this is a non-native to different parts of Ohio, and it is a perennial, so it just keeps on giving. Mare's tail is one of our first super weeds. This weed actually is now resistant to just about every insecticide you can throw at it. You can spray it with Roundup and not kill it. So we call that a super weed because, again, it's become resistant to so many herbicides that it's becoming increasingly difficult to control, and that makes it a very bad weed. Thankfully, the weeds we're talking about today are not resistant. In fact, they're not that hard to kill, but they are really bad weeds because one of these can kill you while the other one might make you wish you were dead. And so we're talking about poison hemlock and wild parsnip. And the occurrences of these two weeds continue to rise across the state. Little side note, I'm sure some of you are thinking, wait a second, entomology, that's about insects. Well, there's actually an insect connection just a bit with wild parsnip. However, the reason I became so involved with teaching about these weeds has to do with what I encountered when I first came to Hamilton County. I'm not a native Cincinnatian. And when I first came here, and I can't believe it's pushing on 30 years ago, there was an extension educator in our office. I was very fortunate that he had 25 years experience. So I sort of had a built-in mentor that was in the office. His name was Nick Freeman, just a wonderful guy. And he really handled a lot of the traditional agriculture. So he still made farm visits and came in one day and he said, Joe, have you ever seen poison hemlock? Well, I didn't know. I'd heard of it, but I'd never seen it. We got in this pickup truck, drove to Western Hamilton County. In fact, I'm not sure if it's Hamilton County or Butler County. It was over there towards the Indiana border, right? That's sort of, you're not really sure which county you're in. And we went up a farm lane a good distance and then got out and walked on a path to a place where it looked like it had been an old hog pen. And there was poison hemlock growing in a patch that wasn't much larger than his pickup truck. We had to go through all that to see poison hemlock. In the intervening time, even though this plant was introduced as an ornamental back in the late 1800s, we don't have to drive anywhere to see it. I can walk from my house and see large amounts of poison hemlock. Wild parsnip has been following a similar trajectory. Now, wild parsnip is kind of an exception to the rule. Poison hemlock introduced as an ornamental. Wild parsnip, we're going to get to how it got here or how we suspect it got here. But the bottom line is both of these weeds are becoming more and more common. And of course, with what a lot of you do for a living, I just took this picture Saturday. You can see it's a nice control effort, keeping it inside the fence, right? This is all poison hemlock. And of course, the construction site is behind this, and there's poison hemlock. We'll see another picture in just a bit, right up against the building, a few plants. And I would suggest probably the folks working here may have no idea that this is a very dangerous plant just outside of their work. Well, it's within their work site. So a little short segue. It's early in the morning, so you got to have a little bit of humor in there to keep everybody awake, right? The Buckeye Yard and Garden Line, as we affectionately call it, the Beagle, fetches timely factual information. And so you can access our website. If you just type bygl.osu.edu, you can go there, BYGL for Buckeye Yard and Garden Line, and you can see it. You can see all the postings. Here are two of mine. This was just day before yesterday, right? May 16th, poison hemlock and wild parsnip are bolting and blooming. Boy, talk about timing. And of course, we're waiting for the periodical cicadas to show up in numbers. Yes, they're coming up here and there in some localized urban heat islands. But I'd say later this week, we're going to really enjoy the full-fledged honor of seeing all these cicadas. I'm sure that some of you are thinking, well, that's just an entomology perspective, right? However, the best way really to get these are in the form of alerts. If you sign up for Beagle Alerts, this is what arrives in your email. This is it. There's nothing more, just a little notice. And you can see this is back April 6th. So at the beginning of April, poison hemlock and wild parsnip, control them now. You'll see why I posted that so early in just a bit. And if you click on the hot link, then you can see the report. You don't have to read it immediately, just, at your leisure, click on it. And of course, then here's the one, like I said, that was just posted on Sunday. And the reason I did it was because of that shot that I took on Saturday. I saw that, my gosh, wild poison hemlock is really bolting. So that means the control clock is quickly winding down. And once again, we'll get to why that's true in just a minute. But click on that hot link and you can read all about it. So this can serve almost like a handout for today, as a matter of fact. So easy to sign up. All you need to do is send an email message to Beagle, bygl-alerts@lists.osu.edu. And then just, in the subject line, subscribe to Beagle Alerts. Now you can, we'll have your email address with your message, but in the message text, you may want to emphasize where you want it sent, or you could have this sent to other email addresses. You can list as many as you want there. So again, timely information. Well, back to the task at hand. Both poison hemlock and wild parsnip belong to the carrot family, Apiaceae. It used to be called umbelliferae. Now, think about when I said umbelliferae. What does that sound like? Umbrella. And that actually, the two names have a similar derivation, and that is they do look like a bit like umbrellas. In fact, we call this arrangement umbels, this type of flower arrangement, where you have a lot of these little flowers borne on these stalks. So that's Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot, which is actually another non-native. And by the way, I won't be showing this again, but Queen Anne's lace does have white flowers, but it shows up later in the season. This is almost a Queen Anne's lace. I look at it as a summer weed, flowering weed. The reason why I'm emphasizing that is because some of the poisonings in the past from poison hemlock came from people mistaking it for wild carrot. However, I want to emphasize that poison hemlock, I think that happened when poison hemlock was much more rare. Now it's so common, and the two don't really look a lot alike. Wild parsnip looks a little bit like, except it's got yellow flowers, very intense yellow flowers. But there you see the umbels, and you see poison hemlock. It's these flowers are yes, umbels, but notice how they're little puffballs as opposed to Queen Anne's lace, which has this very distinct flat top flower arrangement. So let's identify these plants first. With poison hemlock first, I want you to be thinking of carrot leaves, right? Doesn't this look a lot like carrot leaves? It isn't a carrot family, but boy, And we call this bipinnately compound. What that means is you have in every leaf, you have 2 divisions bipinnately, very sharp pointed. You know, you can again see even the foliage is kind of pretty. You can see why this was brought in as an ornamental. It is a kind of a pretty plant. And of course, you know, white flowers. This is a little bit different angle to those flowers. Now, maculatum, the specific epithet, the name macula is Latin for spots. These stems have these purplish spots or blotches. Again, very easy to see. This should not be a difficult plant to identify because, quite frankly, we don't have anything that looks quite like it. Now, wild parsnip, I want you to be thinking with poison hemlock, what are you thinking of? You're thinking of carrots. What does that look like? Well, if you ever get celery that still has the leaves on it, doesn't that look like celery leaves? Wild parsnip, the leaves look very celery-like, and they're big leaves. This is in a rosette. We'll get to what that means in just a minute. So really big lobed leaves. And of course, again, these yellow flowers that do look kind of umbrella-like. And the stems have deep grooves. And I should have mentioned this. Both of the stems for both of these plants are hollow inside. I need to take a picture of that. Although I'd be wearing gloves if I take a picture of wild parsnip stems. Now, when we talk about managing weeds, and this is the part where I know you have a training coming up that talks about fatigue in the workplace, and hopefully I'm not fatiguing you too much with this, but you know, it's important to understand life cycles of weeds in order to understand better how to manage them. And this is an unusual biennial. This may have been the first time you ever heard this if you haven't been working with weeds before, because the weeds that we most commonly think of, we think of annual weeds. So what's a good annual weed? Well, an annual weed is a weed that the seeds germinate in the spring and the weed grows through the summer, and then it flowers and produces seeds in the fall. Now that's actually called a summer annual. Believe it or not, we have winter annuals where it's reversed, where you have the seed actually germinates in the fall and grows through the winter and then produces flowers and new seed in the spring. And then we have these perennial weeds that just never go away. They remain with us all the time. Biennial weeds takes 2 years for them to go from seed to producing new seed. So here I have a drawing I produced to show this, where we have the first year and the second year. And during the first year, we call it the vegetative stage. And then the second year, we call it the reproductive stage. First year, it's growing and producing a long taproot. And then the second year is producing flower and seeds. That's why we call it the reproductive stage. So let's take a close look at just exactly how this progresses. First year, spring through fall, we get seedlings, and we get these rosettes. And then the second year, the plants bolt. They grow from this to becoming very tall and taller until eventually early summer, they start producing flowers and then seed. That seed drops, and then in the fall, the plants die. Actually, these two, I could put it probably mid to late summer, the plants die. Now, unfortunately, with both poison hemlock and wild parsnip, if you go out and find a patch of this, you're going to find plants typically in both of these stages at the same time. Typically, if we have a big infestation, the plants start becoming out of sync. And so you'll find both. Early on, you might find them synchronized. Of course, then this leads to a challenge with management. Again, we'll be talking about that in just a bit. So let's focus on this vegetative stage. So this is what poison hemlock looks like as seedlings. And again, it still looks like the same plant I showed you, that bipinnately compound leaf, that leaf that looks like carrots, right? You can see that very easily with poison hemlock. And this is the rosette stage. So let me go back. This is this stage right here where the plant's growing a big taproot. And these plants they kind of hug the ground. As a matter of fact, that presents a problem with mowing. Mowers will just pass right over this without clipping it off, without doing much harm to it at all. And that presents a bit of a management challenge. Seedlings, though, for wild parsnip are a little different. Again, don't they look like celery leaves popping up? And again, these are the rosettes. They're a little bit taller, but once again, mowers might just clip a bit of these off, but not kill the whole plant. Now, just when you think everything's nice, neat, tidy package, I'm going to throw in something that's a bit of a challenge, and that is that wild parsnip will occasionally stay in the vegetative stage for 2 to 3 years. We call that a monocarpic perennial. I hate the name perennial because it's not really a perennial. It's not going to be there forever, but 2 to 3 years just in this stage. That's important to remember because I'm going to be talking to you a bit with management, and we're going to primarily focus over here with management. But nonetheless, that can occur occasionally. So let's talk about the reproductive stage. In the spring, both of these plants bolt. I mean, they go from being very small to rapidly starting to grow. And of course, this is what poison hemlock looks like as it's starting to grow. Now, I want you to notice it's now rising up enough till if you came along with a mower, you could clip this off and it even gets better. And the same with wild parsnip. This probably took this plant maybe just 2 to 3 days to do this. When they bolt, I love the name bolt because it really goes quickly. Now, these are shots I just took this past Saturday. So you can see this is where they are right now. Poison hemlock, and I say in a high risk location because this is right along a walking trail. And this is a wild parsnip bolting. Now I want to say, it just occurred to me, these are actually along the same trail. This is just further down. So again, one thing that concerns me greatly is the close proximity to people that these plants very often show up in. Now, poison hemlock, when it bolts, it really grows up to be a tall plant. There's a yardstick that I have here, and you can see I'm a 6'2", and truthfully, these plants are getting to where it's kind of hard to reach the top of the plants. So really big plants. Wild parsnip is not as tall, but still can be impressive. So there I am standing. There's poison hemlock in the back, and there's wild parsnip. And we'll get to why it's important to see them that they're both growing together in just a bit. So reproductive stage, once they bolt, they then move towards producing flowers pretty quickly. I have this separated, but I'll tell you, once they start bolting, they start the flower production pretty darn fast. Of course, then those seeds hit the ground. Now, when we think of seeding with these, and this is important, notice the dates. So these are mature seeds on wild parsnip at the 1st of June. Now, that's not too far off, is it? And that's a challenge because what did they say? Once these plants bolt in that reproductive stage, man, they go quickly. Because after all, what every species is about is reproducing to pass along the genes for the next generation to assure the survival of the species. So these plants do not mess around. And once they produce that seed, then the plants again die. And you can see early July, poison hemlock. So these are really almost springtime, early summer plants. This is what poison hemlock looks like when you have mature seed. There's the seed. Now, this is actually, believe it or not, good news. The seed for poison hemlock only remains viable for about 4 to 6 years. And you say, wait a second, Joe, that's a long time. And yes, they can produce a lot of seed. These are prolific seed producers. But some plants, some weeds that we're concerned about have seeds that can remain viable for 20 plus years. So we call this a seed bank, meaning that once the seeds drop, how long does that bank have the ability to make withdrawals? And so only 4 to 6 years. And it's kind of even better for wild parsnip. They're only viable for around 4 years. And there's a relatively low germination rate, about 25 to 30% are all that is going to successfully germinate. So what I'm telling you is that even though these are very, very serious weeds, they do have an Achilles heel. And in this case, it has to do with how long their seeds remain viable. But here's the downside. Seeds germinate when? Late summer, early fall to early spring. Now, this is no doubt why we see eventually in any given patch, the plant's becoming what we call asynchronous, not synchronized. That's because, you know, you can have in the same patch seeds that once they drop, they don't mess around, they start germinating. And then sometimes they germinate only in early fall, and sometimes it's the following spring. And again, that presents a bit of an issue over time. Of course, in the fall, these plants die their second year. I want to reemphasize, first and second year plants are often found together. So what you're seeing with poison hemlock, these are seedlings, and here we have a second year plant bolting right amongst them. And you can see the same thing with wild parsnip. So here's why we're worried. Here's why I'm giving this presentation. Poison hemlock is one of the deadliest plants found in North America. In fact, some might argue it is the most deadly plant, but there are a few others that very much concern us, but not so much in Ohio. But poison hemlock, one of the deadliest plants. It is native to Eurasia and North Africa. It was used to kill Socrates, but not just Socrates, also Theramenes and Phocion. And it's responsible for Socrates' famous last words, "I drink what?" A little humor. We've got to get a little humor. It's early in the morning. Maybe the coffee hasn't kicked in yet. Now, keep in mind that it's the sap and tissues in all parts of the plant that contain an alkaloid neurotoxin, and it must be ingested or enter through the eyes, nose, or cuts. That's an important distinction toxicologically between poison hemlock and wild parsnip. So think of poison hemlock, it's got to get inside of you in some fashion. But of course, when we see these huge infestations like this is all southern Ohio. And this is actually Butler County. Once again, close proximity. That's why I call high risk location to people walking this trail. Look at this. Look at the play area here and all of this poison hemlock on a gas line. Now, some of you may recognize this. This is Voice of America, Butler County Park, and it's going to maybe at first come across like I'm being critical of the parks, but I've been working with a number of our parks. And this park, Voice of America, they've declared war on it for reasons you can see. This is actually after an event last summer, and this is on top of a really high mounded area where they actually do sledding in the winter. And a lot of people, including myself, were on top of that to see some planes fly over. And of course, afterwards, everybody's leaving, and what are they walking through? Poison hemlock. What are these kids in? Poison hemlock. Poison hemlock. This really scared the heck out of me. And as a matter of fact, in both cases, I probably thought I was a crazy guy. I came down over the hill and made sure the fathers understood, don't let your children in this area. And because of that, Voice of America has declared war. We'll see this shot again. There's the hill, and they are doing it. They've declared war on both poison hemlock and wild parsnip, which is a good idea. But once again, here's that construction site. And if you look over here, I mean, people coming and going, workers coming in and out, that's poison hemlock right there in the background. So very heavy infestation all around this work site. Wild parsnip. As I said, I'm actually a little more concerned about wild parsnip. You might say, wait a second, Joe, poison hemlock killed Socrates. Well, you have to ingest it. Sap that wild parsnip has sap that contains psoralen, which is in a chemical class called linear furanocoumarins. And these are photosensitizer compounds. As a matter of fact, you might recognize the word psoralen, psoriasis. There's actually, these chemicals are actually used to treat psoriasis. And if you've ever had or known anyone to have psoriasis, sometimes the treatment is that a material is rubbed on the area and then exposed to ultraviolet light. Well, that's exactly what happens with wild parsnip with the sap. It kills epidermal cells by inhibiting DNA synthesis. And these are very important cells to protect us against long wave ultraviolet radiation. But here is the problem with wild parsnip. The problem is that you get exposed, you have to get, well, it sounds kind of funny to say, well, you have to get this, but the problem is that sap exposure first, then exposure to UV radiation before you get the severe blistering. So it means that symptoms may not happen for 48 to 72 hours afterwards. A person may forget or may not even be aware that they were exposed to wild parsnip sap by the time they see this severe blistering. Now, this was a gardener up in Columbus, and I got this this picture actually came from the Wexner Medical Center. And here's another challenge. When I was contacted about this situation, the reason I was contacted is the physicians actually thought this might be arthropod dam. In other words, an insect or a mite or something, and they want to know what could do that. And that leads to something you need to be aware of. Our medical community is becoming more and more aware of this problem because this is the same reaction that happens with giant hogweed. We'll get in that in just a minute. But you can still have physicians that aren't aware of it and may think that this blistering is being caused by something else. And here's the giant hogweed. Now, in Ohio, giant hogweed has only been found in the extreme northeast part of the state. Ashtabula County is, to my knowledge, the only place we found it. Now, Thomas Denholm here is showing us how you would handle giant hogweed. Notice what he has on. He's completely covered up. His eyes are protected, and he's wearing chemical resistant gloves. I would actually like to see him in a face shield. In fact, I would like to see, if you're ever dealing with this plant or wild parsnip, it would be good when you talk about personal protection equipment to consider really being covered up well. But the name says it all, giant hogweed. Giant hogweed has made the news in the last few years. There's an unfortunate case in Virginia where a teenager got the sap in his eyes and created some very serious damage, whereas wild parsnip does exactly the same thing. Frankly, it's a bit frustrating in raising awareness because giant hogweed really does sound pretty, it sounds, that really does sound threatening. Whereas wild parsnip sounds like you're getting attacked by a vegetable. Phytophotodermatitis is the reaction. Phyto, plant, photodermatitis, because you have to have the plant and then you get the exposure to the light. And just to reemphasize, it's not phytophotodermatitis, but that's a good way to remember it, actually. And here's why we're so concerned. Once again, high-risk locations, walking trail. This is VOA. By the way, this patch is gone. It's been herbicided out. This is actually, I don't mind telling you where this is, and they don't mind me telling you. This is actually at Glenwood Gardens. And this is all gone, but you can see the high-risk location. And I'm not kidding when I say don't walk through this field. I would not walk through this field because the sap from just walking through, you're going to get sap on you. Now, it might go through your pants, in which case, unless, you're running around with your pants off under UV light, you might not have a problem, but you're certainly going to get it on your arms. And so this, again, is why we're so concerned. By the way, Glenwood Gardens, that patch is gone. They've declared war on it too. Now, here's the challenge with wild parsnip. Now, I kind of mentioned this beforehand. It has exactly the same scientific name as cultivated parsnip. As a matter of fact, the plants are basically the same plants. And it kind of goes back to, okay, how did people discover they could eat certain things? And it's probably exactly the same with tomatoes and potatoes, which of course are native to South America. If you go look at the native plants for corn in South America, for maize, I should say, for potatoes and tomatoes, those native plants, well, they don't look anything like the ones that are cultivated. Wild parsnip is kind of the same way. It is native to Europe. No doubt somebody came across it at some point and for whatever reason decided to try out the root. But the wild parsnip we have, even though there is a root, it's nothing like you'd see in the supermarket. The wild parsnip is very fibrous. It could be, Cooking would get rid of the sorlin, but of course you wouldn't want to do that. But what we think has happened is that the wild parsnip we see actually escaped from cultivation. How that happened, no one knows, but it was brought here and cultivated and then escaped. And then some of those wild plants reverted, or some of those cultivated plants started reverting back. The genes were already there. So that's why they share the same scientific name. Now, why is it then that you can have parsnip? I keep saying wild. You can have parsnip in your garden. I actually like parsnips quite a lot, a very sweet carrot flavor. Why can you have it in your garden, but if you have it in your landscaping, you can have a real problem. And by the way, a little side note, if you are growing parsnips in your garden, they do have a little bit of the sorlin in the foliage, in the sap. Not much, but you just need to be aware of that. I recommend for gardeners that you wear gloves when handling the entire plant, but not nearly as much toxicity as you'd see in the wild version. And this paper was published back in 2005 and actually published by a couple of entomologists, because there is a connection, increase in toxicity of an invasive weed after reassociation with its co-evolved herbivore. You can see that's how scientists and entomologists, we all think. We want to make the titles so that you cannot figure out exactly what the paper is about. But if you read in this paper, you can clearly see what happened. Parsnip webworm. Plants collected before the introduction of webworms in North America and during the earliest stages of establishment are lower in toxic foranicoumarins. That's the, sorlins belong to this group, than all plants collected subsequently in North America, and lower than European plant samples collected before 1889. What are they saying? What they're saying is escaped wild parsnip became more toxic in response to being fed upon. And this brings up a very important point. You may ask yourself, well, why is poison hemlock so poisonous to mammals? And why is wild parsnip so destructive to mammals? Well, that's because these compounds that affect us are actually considered chemical defense compounds. The plants aren't just producing them for their, just for a kick. They're actually producing them to protect against herbivory, being fed upon by things. So it stands to reason when you think about it, with wild parsnip, the plants that are in the garden don't need to be defended, presumably because somebody's taking care of them. So they don't need to spend energy producing defense chemicals. However, if those plants start getting fed upon, if something starts destroying the foliage, that plant has within its genes the capability to start triggering production of the foranicoumarins, the defense chemicals. And parsnip webworm, as its name implies, is a non-native pest of parsnip. Now, unfortunately, even though it's pretty destructive, I've never seen it be so destructive as to being something we can rely on as a biocontrol. Although occasionally I do see patches very seriously affected by this, but in response to the caterpillars eating this plant, the plant starts producing defense chemicals. So that's how all this started unwinding. Of course, they even bore into the stalks. But this is not the only insect. Our native four-lane plant bugs really do a number on wild parsnip. They have sucking mouth parts. They suck out sap. And even eastern black swallowtail butterfly caterpillars will feed on wild parsnip. So a lot that will trigger this defense. Okay, so here's the other problem. In fact, I consider this to be a huge problem in Ohio. For reasons we don't understand, maybe it's because they require similar, environmental conditions. It is very common to find these plants growing together. Extremely common. You can see this. There's the bloom for wild parsnip, and here's poison hemlock. Very clear, right together. Look at this. It's almost like this is an ornamental planting with both of them. And even in the bolting stage, even in the rosette stage, there's wild parsnip, there's poison hemlock. Look at this, right together. And you can clearly see, remember the carrot leaves and the celery leaves growing together. Now, why is that such a problem? Because their toxicology is often muddled by those that are exposed. Now, this is anecdotal. That gardener in Columbus who had all those blisters, believe it or not, I talked to her on the phone, and believe it or not, she knew poison hemlock. She knew what poison hemlock looked like. And she was actually out there pulling weeds, including poison hemlock. But then, unfortunately, within the poison hemlock were some wild parsnip plants. And once photodermatitis developed, well, she knew that it didn't come from poison hemlock, except here's the problem. She knew that. But if people that don't know that have the same problem, what might be your conclusion? The conclusion is, well, I was pulling poison hemlock and I got all these blisters. And that's a real problem. I mean, not picking on anybody, but if you go online and you look into type poison hemlock rash or poison hemlock blisters, you will find postings that have been put there because of this misunderstanding. And you can see, what does a poison hemlock rash look like? Well, they talk about symptoms of poisoning, and it's true. Nausea, confusion. Remember, we have a neurotoxin in poison hemlock. But then let me zoom in. Poison hemlock rash. No, poison hemlock does not have the psoralen, does not have those furanocoumarins in there. So this came out of mistaken identity. It's not true, but it does create confusion, obviously, and you can see how that can happen. The bottom line, poison hemlock mode of action, nicotinic blocks this coniine, blocks nicotinic acetylcholine. And if you've done any teaching about pesticides, you'll know that this is exactly what some of our older pesticides, insecticides, I should say, would do. And routes of exposure, ingestion, maybe eyes. And when I say dosage, usually very low. Usually, people don't get enough through their eyes or through cuts to have to be poisoned. Whereas ingestion, that's a leading cause of mortality. Whereas with wild parsnip, you have the psoralens and then interaction with UV light to get the topical result. And also you need to be aware a problem with your eyes. So that topical result, and I'm sorry to keep showing this early in the morning. I realize but it really is very serious. It's a very serious thing. So management, let's consider the power of the triangle. Now, what am I referring to? Well, as an entomologist, I will tell you that if you're going to manage a pest, we would recommend you use integrated pest management. So what we call a multi-tactic approach. So there's a lot of tools in the toolbox. And what we would recommend is to not just spray chemicals. Why? Well, because the pest can become resistant. That you use cultural in conjunction with biological meaning something feeds on it, something feeds on the insect, and then monitor the results. This concept has been around since 1967 for pest management. In recent years, folks involved with weed management have come up with a very similar idea, integrated vegetation management. What are we saying? Well, what we're saying is don't just spray, but also consider these other tactics to help manage weeds, like dandelions. It can get truly out of hand very quickly. So management of poison hemlock and wild parsnip, cultivation or mowing prior to flowering. Very important if people wait for these plants to flower. And that's why today's presentation is so timely, because what did I just say? These plants are bolting right now. They are starting to flower. We're still a little ahead of the curve, but this hot weather that's going to happen later this week is really going to push them hard, meaning that you really need to do something about it right now. However, if you're going to be mowing, which is a method to manage these, and you can see this person is mowing in an area where there's poison hemlock. and he actually has face and head covering. He's broken down, that's why he's like that, but you can see he's in a full suit, have personal protection equipment. So if you're going to be knowingly mowing these plants, then cover up, make sure and be covered up. You can see, just completely like in a fur coat, cover up. This is unsafe mowing practice. This is not the way to go managing and mowing poison hemlock or wild parsnip. But here we have at Voice of America, I think they might be trying a few things out, because over here is herbicide. This patch has been mowed, and you can see there is poison hemlock after it's bolted. Well, this plant's doomed. It's a biennial. So if you cut it off, it does not have the capacity to produce a new top. So mowing is an option. Just be aware that, that's poisonous sap if you get it in your eyes, and certainly not in your mouth. If this were wild parsnip, I'm not sure I would mow it. There have been documented cases with wild parsnip of people having blistering after coming in contact with equipment, that has the sap on it. And also, don't use string trimmers, don't use weed eaters, because that just flings the sap all over the place. Once again, there have been documented cases of blistering after that exposure. So what did I say before relative to mowing? These rosettes, remember the picture of poison hemlock, too low to mow. So, and if you mow here after flowering, you're doing nothing. So the target are the rosettes. In other words, if mowing is going to be used, right now is the time to do it. But once again, I'd be very cautious with wild parsnip. So this is too late for poison hemlock. These flowers are already to the stage where even if you cut them, these seed heads could possibly still produce, or these flowers could possibly produce seed. This is way too late. There's already seed set on these plants. Now, again, sometimes with what I do for a living, I try not to embarrass people, but here's a case. This is a Texas Eastern gas line. It passes right to the back of my neighborhood. And this is the walking trail. And you can see here are kids playing. I have watched this gas line go from where poison hemlock was rare to where it is now one of the dominant plants in this right of way because of inappropriate mowing. For whatever reason, they continue to mow late in the season after the poison hemlock seeds. So what they're really doing is they're getting rid of all the competition. And what's left are the poison hemlock seeds with no competition. So you just keep getting a bigger and bigger infestation. So there's what it looks like. It just continues to get more. And again, a dangerous situation. And this is what it looked like last summer. Again, it went from none, basically, well, there had to be some there, but very few plants. I walk this quite often, and maybe I would see one here and one there, to this is almost solid. So herbicides can be used. Now I'm going to divide these herbicides up. Pre-emergent means that it affects germination. It doesn't kill the seed. It just affects how well the seed can germinate and produce new plants. However, unfortunately, with both of these plants, we really don't have good data. And I would never depend on somebody saying, well, I used it and it worked well. We can't depend on the anecdotal accounts. However, we can use what are called non-selective post-emergent. What does that mean? Post-emergent means that the weeds have already emerged from the seed, so they're growing plants. But what does non-selective mean? Well, if we're looking at something like Roundup, that's a perfect example. It kills any plant. So non-selective post-emergent means it kills any plant. Roundup can work, glyphosate can work. There are a number of other post-emergents with non-selectives that will work. But obviously before the second season plants bolt and before flowering, the problem with non-selective is it eliminates competition. And these are opportunistic weeds. That's actually what happened with the gas line. If you release these weeds, that's what it's called, by reducing the competition, you can end up selecting for these weeds. The solution then, if you're using a non-selective, is to do some overseeding to generate competition. These weeds, this is a park here in Butler County, and this is a wetlands area, but this is more like a pasture. But the point of it is that these plants will not compete against grasses. So best time to apply is not here because spring germinating plants can escape, not here because seeds are already being produced from the flowers, spraying to target those bolting plants, the best targeting time. Now, what about selective post-emergence? What am I saying? Post-emergent, once again, the plants have emerged from the seed. You have growing plants. Selective means you're not killing every plant. You're killing only the target plants, but you're not killing other plants. The target time is before the second season plants bolt. It's the same as with non-selective herbicides and before flowering. Now, here's the advantage of selective post-emergent herbicides. You can select for competitive plants. And look at all these products. Like I said before, quite frankly, poison hemlock and wild parsnip, so far, we've not seen resistance. So quite a few plants or quite a few products to choose from. But again, spraying here, not over here or not here. This is too late, too soon, because seeds can germinate and just continue to contribute, but spraying here. And here are some case studies. This is actually at Glenwood Gardens. And you can see there is a big patch of poison hemlock. Mid-May, they made an application of chlorpyralid. Once again, let me just go back. That's in this list as effective post-emergent selective. And selective because chlorpyralid does not kill grasses. So you're taking out poison hemlock. And this is that same field in 2020. There's a little bit of poison or wild parsnip here and there, but not bad. But this field, particularly right over here, was almost solid poison hemlock, but they selectively took it out, and the competitive grasses are keeping it suppressed. Here's triamine. That's another herbicide product applied mid-April. Again, you can see it, taking it out. And here is triamine against wild parsnip. Again, not difficult. Now, this is that same field that I said don't walk in 2019. They boom spray, meaning they had a tractor with a boom behind it to cover this entire field. But notice what's in this field. This field had a lot of grasses. And so this is after the triamine application. And, unfortunately, you can't tell. This is not wild parsnip. So what you're seeing is a field that's slowly being converted back to grasses. This is Voice of America. I want you to notice these humps. Each one very heavily infested with poison hemlock. And this is what it looked like Saturday. So again, they've declared war on it, and they're really working hard to take it out. We're getting close to the end. I realize I only have about 4 more minutes. I know many of you have already gotten up and started dancing around a little bit, but a few final points relative to managing poison hemlock and wild parsnip. Start management before you're dealing with this. If you have a construction site, take it out so your employees are not exposed to either one of these plants. And also consider the future, because after construction, there's still going to be a lot of weed seed around. The downside in any given situation is that neither one of these are going to be taken out with a single herbicide application or a single mowing. So combine suppression with enhancing plant competition. Remember the power of integrated vegetation management. Combining suppression with enhancement of plant competition, like this field with grasses. It's why we don't typically see poison hemlock and wild parsnip in horse paddocks or pastures if properly managed. That brings me kind of to the end here, and I'm sorry, this is just a very bad joke, but with the Derby and Preakness and all that, I couldn't help myself. These bad weeds are not going to be eradicated from Ohio. So what should we do? Well, focus on managing where they present a hazard, like along trails. And then the other thing is, don't become too worried about going outside because of these. you know, it's one thing that occurred to me as I've been making people more and more aware. I don't want to scare people to not go outside, but basically we need to do exactly what we've all learned to do. We just teach people what to look for, just like with poison ivy. I mean, leaves a 3, leave it be. So we've all learned that. Of course, sometimes it kind of goes by the wayside. Which one of these is poison ivy and which one is a box elder tree? This is box elder and that's poison ivy. They do look a lot alike. But that confusion might just lead to a rash. Once again, confusion with these plants could be more serious. Which one can kill you and which one might make you wish you were dead? Well, let me go back. Obviously, poison hemlock, wild parsnip. The true voyage of discovery lies not in finding new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And hopefully I've given you some new eyes on what to look for when you're out and about. Oh, thanks, Susan. I didn't know. I mean, you had it open up for applause. That's outstanding.
Thank you, Joe, so much. What a fascinating presentation. I know there's got to be questions, and I'm getting some comments in the chat from people who are talking about it being very informative, but we do have a few minutes, and if anybody has a particular issue they'd like clarification of, now would be the time. Either enter it into the chat or go ahead and just unmute and share with the group. Before I sign off, I just want to remind everyone to mark your calendar for the 3rd Tuesday in June for our, which is the 15th, for our final Safety Council meeting of the current year. Then we will start up anew in July. We'll continue with our virtual meeting format due to the COVID pandemic not being completely clear. If you are a member of this Safety Council's planning committee and you could stay on the line for a few minutes after we close up, that would be great. I want to just convey a couple of brief pieces of information for the planning committee. Anybody here got a question, concern, comment directed to Joe?
Yeah, I do think Ohio State will beat Michigan again this year. Wait a second. Was that? I thought that was a comment.
Yeah, well, surprising you didn't get any comments on that.
Well, I thought I'd just preload it.
Yeah, excellent. Has anybody here ever had an issue with either of these two plants, the poison hemlock or wild parsnip?
This is Greg. I know I just kind of mentioned this earlier, but I know I grew up on a farm, and I mean, I walked through so many weeds through my life, and that was just something I was raised to do. My dad said, "Hey, I need you to go over there and do whatever." I did it, and when I kind of went, started working, years back, I was a lineman, and my goal was to get the poles, erected, and the guy wires in place, and run the cable and stuff like that. And this was not something I was ever trained on. So I think it's really important to make sure we get this information out to employees, especially if you have employees that are working outside. They're liable to, this isn't something we typically train our employees on. So I think I would, encourage everybody on this call to make sure you add that to, your onboarding, make it a toolbox talk. It's great information, but make sure you get it out to your employees and your kids.
Yeah.
That's very interesting you brought that up because, likewise, I grew up on a farm, West Virginia, and we have a family farm. And I really didn't, I mean, I knew poison ivy. We didn't have poison oak. That's a Western plant that's sometimes misunderstood out here. But we had poison ivy, knew what poison ivy was. I'll tell you another topic, Susan, maybe you've had someone cover this. But another challenge that I paid no attention to growing up, when I would go out, American dog ticks were so common that we just simply accepted the idea that we were going to get ticks on us. We come back and, look ourselves over and that was that. I mean, didn't give it any thought at all. If you've not had someone give a talk, and I mean, if you had this, ticks, because right now, we really have some extremely serious ticks in Ohio, beyond American dog tick. We have the black leg tick, which of course is responsible for spreading Lyme disease. It's now endemic in our part of the country. We also have 2 new ticks that have been discovered that all can lead to spreading diseases that I am telling you can be incapacitating. So for example, I don't go out now at all to knock around the weeds without having treated clothing on. And if people think that DEET, for example, used to keep mosquitoes off of you are going to work well, that's a misconception. DEET can work a little bit, but not nearly as well as, for example, the permethrin, which you can treat your clothes with. You can even buy clothes that are pre-treated. So I'm sorry to launch into something entomological, but if you're talking about worker safety, I got to tell you, if you have workers that are out there knocking around the weeds, you need to be aware of tick problems.
Great information, Joe. And by the way, this presentation has been recorded. So as soon as there's a little editing done, we'll have that up on the Tri-State Area Safety Council website. Out of respect for everyone's time.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm
hey, no,
way over.
No problem.
Yeah.
No, you're not. It's fine. But I know folks that have hard stops at 8:45 or so. So please feel free to leave this meeting. And as mentioned, if you are currently serving or you want to serve on the steering committee for this group, please stay on for another 5 or 10 minutes. And Joe, thank you so very much. We look forward to welcoming you back to this council. And I love your idea of a presentation on dog ticks and Lyme disease. We'll stay in touch. And thank you so much.
I will. In fact, I'll send you a name of a person that could do a nice job if you're interested. Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.